ตอบโจทย์วันนี้ท่ามกลางภาวะความขัดแย้งทางการเมืองที่กำลังเกิดขึ้นนะคะก็มีความพยายามที่จะต้องเดินหน้าปฏิรูปประเทศเป็นความพยายามของเครือข่ายเดินหน้าปฏิรูปที่จัดงานเพื่อที่จะพูดคุยกันเรื่องการปฏิรูปประเทศนะคะวันนี้ได้เชิญผู้เชี่ยวชาญที่เคยเข้ามามีส่วนร่วมในเรื่องของกระบวนการปฏิรูปในประเทศต่างๆและได้ถอดบทเรียนจากประเทศต่างๆมาแล้วนะคะที่เผชิญความขัดแย้งวันนี้วิทยากรทั้ง3ท่านที่ได้ร่วมงานกับเครือข่ายเดินหน้าปฏิรูปจะแลกเปลี่ยนในตอบโจทย์นะคะท่านแรกค่ะดรไมเคิลวาติคิโอติสค่ะจาก Center for Humanitarian Dialogue เป็นผู้ที่ทำงานเกี่ยวกับความขัดแย้งในเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้มีองค์ความรู้จากทางอินโดนีเซียฟิลิปปินส์เมียนมารวมถึงเกี่ยวกับไทยนะคะที่จะแลกเปลี่ยนถัดไปค่ะดรคาเทียพาพาจิอันนี่เป็นผู้ที่เข้าสู่กระบวนการศาลเสวนาแห่งชาตินะคะในประเทศที่ผ่านความขัดแย้งไม่ว่าจะเป็นลิเบียไลบีเรียเยเมนนะคะโดยเฉพาะเยเมนซึ่งก็น่าจะมีรายละเอียดมาพูดคุยแบ่งปันกันถัดไปค่ะคุณอดัมคาเฮนเคยเข้ามาสัมผัสประเทศไทยแล้วนะคะท่ามกลางบรรยากาศที่ขัดแย้งแล้วก็ทำงานเกาะติดสถานการณ์ในไทยอย่างต่อเนื่องโดยเฉพาะกับโปรเจกต์โครงการ Scenario Thailand ค่ะคุณอดัมคาเฮนเป็นผู้ที่เชี่ยวชาญเรื่องกระบวนการจัดการปัญหาสังคมที่ซับซ้อนวันนี้ทั้ง3ท่านมีองค์ความรู้เรื่องของการแก้ไขปัญหาความขัดแย้งมาพูดคุยกันนะคะ Thank you three of you for joining me I'd like to start with Adam Kahen you've been to Thailand for several times and you've been in discussion with several groups in trying to solve the conflicts or trying to set the path for the scenario for Thailand. What do you evaluate the current situation so far? Is it getting better, getting worse?
Well, I think in a sense it's both. Certainly the protests and the stopping of the government and the violence the last few weeks is worse than it has been, at least in the period I've been coming over the last few years. And it's worrying, certainly worrying to me, I think worrying to Thais. It's getting better only in the sense that I think everybody in Thailand is now aware that there is a danger and that action is required. I sometimes felt during the last year, during the period we've been having the Scenario Thailand workshops, the Scenario Thailand group understood the underlying crisis, but other people weren't aware of them or didn't think it was very serious. Now, I don't think anybody is making that mistake. So this, for me, is a hopeful sign, and the fact that there is so much focus and so many efforts and so many people, even people who wished they didn't have to be involved, but now see they have to be because the danger is so obvious.
You see, it's really the right timing to get serious.
Yes, and certainly, if I compare the conversations I've had in the last week to the same conversations 3 months ago, the conversations are more serious, and I consider this to be a hopeful sign. The other hopeful sign, and this is both, what is it that's positive in a situation which is dangerous? The other positive sign is that the idea that we could just wait for somebody else to solve this problem for us, the government or a good leader or an external party, this illusion is also gone. There's really nobody here to work on it except the Thai actors themselves, and I consider that to be a realistic and, in that sense, a positive understanding.
Dr. Watikiotis, how do you see the things can really get moving if people think it's time to get serious, but how can we really get things moving?
Well, I think it's been serious for a very long time. I think this is a crisis that has started over 8 years ago, almost a decade of political crisis and paralysis. And the political actors have all along known that there is a need to sit down and talk, but they've been unable to do so, partly because the positions that they have made for themselves on either side of the conflict are held very strongly And also, I think it's very important to point out that the political system has been broken for so long here that normal avenues or channels of discourse have not been working. For instance, it's very evident for the last 2 or 3 years that the parliament has not functioned properly. The opposition does not speak to the government. The government does not speak to the opposition through normal channels of political discourse. There have been talks of a private nature, of a confidential nature, to get the two sides talking to one another. But even there, it's been very, very difficult to get them to sort of establish some common ground. So this is a protracted political crisis where even though civil society and the public and the business sector are now realizing that there's a need to do something, the fact that the normal channels of political discourse have not been working is a very serious problem.
How do you see it as Asian culture or Southeast Asia culture of saving face is very big issue, is such a priority? And
It's a
to
very
what
good
extent
point.
do you see it in Thailand?
And this is a common thing in the region as a whole. I mean, everyone has slightly different traditions. In the Indonesian context, for instance, there is a much more developed culture of reaching compromise through deliberation and establishing a consensus. Even though everyone leaves the room feeling they didn't quite get what they wanted, there is a much more established tradition of deliberation, usually in public, and then the reaching of a consensus that leaves everyone more or less satisfied, even though they don't get quite what they want. That seems to be missing here. Of course, Thais have, for a very long time, prided themselves in the fact that they've avoided confrontation. There's this very, very strong avoidance of confrontation, partly because once confrontation takes place, it's very difficult for people to retreat from their positions because of the face issue.
That's very cultural issue as well. Dr. Katja, because you've been working in Asian context as well as in Middle East context, can you see the difference here between Asian culture and Middle East culture? What can you share with us?
As Michael was speaking about the issue of face saving, I was thinking to myself that actually it's not that different in most cultures in the world, especially when it comes to leaders. Political leaders always want to be seen among their voters and their constituencies that they are the charismatic personalities that can actually lead the country forward. How that manifests itself, it may change in the way people behave, but fundamentally at the leadership level, it's very difficult to make compromises and to look like you're giving in public in front of your constituency, especially when you are in a democratic political system where you're judged every 4 years or every 5 years at the ballot box. And if you're not seen as someone who is decisive, charismatic, of leadership quality, then you're not going to be re-elected. So it's not really that different in other parts of the world, I would say. Yeah.
Is it necessary for a national dialogue process that it has to begin with the two leading opponents of each camp, or you can start from the ground, from civil society, from people sector?
You can be very creative when it comes to national dialogue processes. The important thing is that society as a whole has come to the realization that actually the way to get out of whatever the crisis is that is facing the country is through a dialogue. And sometimes the momentum comes from the grassroots. If you look at the Middle East, the momentum came from street revolutions. And then in places like in Tunisia and Yemen, the street revolutions led to compromises at the elite leadership level that led to national dialogue processes. So it was a 3-stage process. In other countries, the decision comes from the top. The top leaders, regardless of the degree of pressure from the bottom, take the decision to actually create a small agreement among themselves that then they expand to include more and more people in the negotiation. So it can happen both ways, and both ways are effective. But what is important is that at some point before a real political dialogue starts, the political leaders have to be in the process. They have to buy in and they have to commit and take responsibility for the outcomes and the process itself. Otherwise, the process runs the danger of being an interesting conference that takes place on the side, as opposed to a negotiation and a discussion that actually will influence the future of the country.
What about you, Adam? Do you see the first step is to bring in opposing parties for negotiation first? Should it be the first step?
I understand what Katja has said, but I guess I take the view that you have to start wherever you can start. And the Thai situation is unusual. It's not. There would be other examples of this, but it's unusual in that the political system and the functioning of the government itself have seized up. So, although I think what you say is ideally preferable, in my opinion, waiting until that's settled before beginning the dialogue is not necessary and is not advisable. And we don't know where the breakthroughs will come from. We don't know where the understandings or relationships or openings will occur that allow political reforms, economic reforms, agricultural reforms, social reforms to take place. And so I would be inclined to start where we are with the people who are willing to engage and take it from there with always keeping in mind the objective of bringing in the missing actors as and when possible. But I think there's a risk, a serious risk in the Thai context of the political actors holding the rest of the country hostage by saying, well, until we're ready, nothing can happen. And this is dangerous.
I think Adam's right, and there's another very important reason, which is, of course, in this current context, everyone is polarized. There doesn't seem to be the capacity of anyone to sort of somehow take a neutral and impartial view. There are no local adjudicators, arbiters, the academic world, the business world. It's very, very hard to find people who are not taking sides. And so another reason, I think, to start now by convening people is to do what this Reform Now network is trying to do, which is to establish that middle ground and to seize it and to sort of say, well, actually, we may not be fully representative, we may not have everyone in the room, but at least we're trying to do something for the sake of the country and not for the sake of one interest or the other.
So they just need to keep going, whether the political parties or political leaders will join the process or not. Just keep
create
going.
The momentum. You create a momentum, you generate ideas. I think we all agree by starting, as someone has to start, and as Michael says, having and I think Adam also, having this middle force that doesn't take any side and generates ideas that are impartial, hopefully, and seen as and trusted by all sides. It's a very valuable resource for whatever dialogue takes place later down the line.
But Michael just said it's very hard these days to find people with neutral voice. Have you seen this kind of situation before in Thailand?
No, I think this is quite a recent development. I've worked and lived in Thailand for the last 30 years on and off, first as a student, then as a journalist, and now doing the work that I'm doing for the last 10 years. To me, there has been a change in the sense that 20 years ago, Thailand had a body of technocrats, had a body of bureaucrats, academics, who kind of looked more or less impartially and objectively at the situation, at the challenges facing the country. You had institutions like NIDA, the NESDB, the Thai Development and Research Council, who had sort of, qualified, very, very qualified academics and experts and specialists, many of them educated overseas, but not all of them, who were able to look at the challenges facing the country and say, well, actually, we recommend, from a professional standpoint, from an objective standpoint, that maybe the country should be doing this or doing that. And lo and behold, the politicians would listen. I referred earlier to the process of bringing together everyone to draft a new constitution in 1997. That was a process that everyone admired and looked up to, not just in Thailand but around the region, because the country came together. There was a consultative process. Everyone more or less agreed on the need for reform and change, and there was a body of people who were drafting the constitution from an objective standpoint. Now I see in the current crisis that we've lost this ability here in Thailand to find people who are impartial, who are looking at doing something for the interests of the country and not for the interest of one side or the other.
What's the risk are we facing, Adam? Are we on the verge of separatism or entering civil war?
Well, let me say two things. I mean, all of these risks are there. You can make a list of as many things as you want of things that can go wrong: fragmentation, civil war, polarization, social crisis, economic collapse, political gridlock. This is all possible, but for me to say, is this going to happen, is asking the wrong question. Because whether this happens is not based on some the reason the future is uncertain is because ties will determine the future. And therefore, when people say, do you predict this will happen? To me, this is a nonsensical question. The question is...
We shouldn't ask at all.
Well, for me, the question is not what will happen, but what will ties do now about the situation, including such scenarios. My experience in Thailand is much more recent than yours. I've only been coming the last few years, but I have been very impressed in the group that you and I have both had contact with, the Scenario Thailand group, that in two factors. Firstly, there were enough neutral people to be able to convene that group. The Scenario Thailand organizers or conveners or organizing committee, including the Journalists Association, amongst others, succeeded in bringing together a completely heterogeneous group. And secondly, and this is maybe even more important, this completely heterogeneous group, including politicians from both sides, and yellow shirts and red shirts and military people and NGOs and community leaders, managed, in spite of their differences, to talk, to listen, to come to certain shared understandings about what is happening, what could happen. So based on that admittedly limited and modest experience, I believe that Thais completely have the capacity to talk to one another and to work things out. Doesn't mean it's easy, doesn't mean it will happen for sure, but the idea that it can't be done, to me, is nonsense.
I interviewed you the first time perhaps a few years ago, and you told me that Thailand's trouble is not that difficult, and you still have high hope that Thai people can solve the problem. But now, 3 years later, you are still here. Do you still have that hope that Thai people can solve the problems?
Absolutely.
Dr. Kachia, do you think they really need to speed up fear factor if they paint picture of worst thing going to happen to Thailand, like separatism or failed state? Perhaps it will help people or help opposing parties to enter to national dialogue process.
I'm not sure that resorting to fear is usually always a constructive strategy. I'm very encouraged by what Adam just said. You know, in our field, sometimes we use the word sliding into war. And many societies just allow themselves to slide into war. Either they're confident that this has never happened to their societies before, that they are peaceful people, that war is really something that happens to others and not to them. And somehow by not really acting immediately, as Adam said, they find themselves waking up one day and these awful events are taking place in their neighborhood. But from just observing this morning's conversation and the activities of the network and what both Michael and Adam are describing, it sounds like Thailand is not such a society. It sounds like people are taking the situation seriously and that they're mobilizing and that there is some social capital to build on in order to prevent the wars. But at the same time, it's time for compromise, my understanding is. And the way to construct the situation where the most influential groups can sit down and discreetly negotiate some compromises, maybe where we are now.
What are resources that you think we still can rely on for Thai people to really stimulate or get back together, sit down and talk?
Well, I'm just to pick up on Katya's point, and it was a point made earlier by various speakers in the forum we just attended on the need for confidentiality. There is a tendency in Southeast Asia for people to want to negotiate in public because negotiating in public gives people, the participants in that negotiation, the affirmation that they're doing something good, and even though they don't want to agree with the other party, at least they're doing something good. The problem with confidential, secret negotiations is that people really do have to put their interests on the line and compromise in a way that's more sincere and honest. And that's what we've not seen to date. Having said that, I think it is very important for the political actors to sit down, and I know from long discussions among them that actually they're not too distant in terms of their positions. All the political factions in this country agree on the need for political reform. The content of the reforms are generally agreed upon, which is that there needs to be a reform of the electoral system, that there needs to be some form of decentralization to empower people at other levels of society, and a need to address corruption and the scourge of money politics. Everyone agrees on that agenda. The problem is that, as always in these reform situations, there are going to be key interests that fear that if the reforms go through in an untrammeled way, in an uncontrolled way, that they will lose their interests. And that goes for both sides. So I think there's a lot of commonality. What's missing is the willingness to sit down sincerely and engage in a discreet, confidential process of negotiation.
It seems the only hope that actually they can really talk to on one thing, that they can agree on one term, is reform. But what should be the bridge to bring those people together?
This is the most difficult step, as probably both Adam and Michael agree on. How do you get from the dispute to where you know you have to go? And it's always different how different societies and
Does
leaders...
it have to get worse first?
No, not necessarily. And you know, this theory that war and suffering makes people realize how dialogue is needed has many flaws, because the more people suffer, the more people are victimized, the emotions get harder and the deeper felt, and it makes it a lot more difficult to engage with the other side, the enemy. Yes, and then you probably need outsiders to help you in situations where tens of thousands of people have been killed. It's very difficult to just get in a room together without someone facilitating it. So I wouldn't say that getting a situation worse actually makes dialogue easier.
What do leaders need to think of in terms of sacrificing their stance when entering negotiation?
Well, eventually compromise and, in that sense, sacrifice will be required, but I don't think that's where we need to start. I think if you want a simple starting point, it would be, let me see if I can understand the other person's perspective. I don't have to agree with it, I don't have to like it, but let me at least try to understand why is my opponent saying and feeling and acting as they are.
For you, what is the most confusing part for Thailand at the moment?
Well, for me, the confusing part is why the political actors, why they think they can win. And why they are willing to risk so much in order to defeat their opponents. It seems to me so much is now at risk in the economy, in people's lives, even in the integrity and harmony of the country. And why are the two sides willing to risk that rather than enter into discussion? This, I must say, I find perplexing.
What about you, Michael?
To give you an answer partially, perhaps, I think we all recognize that what we see on the streets is an elaborate design. On both sides of the political divide, there are people who are paid, who are hired, who are mobilized, whether it's through money, whether it's through rhetoric, whether it's through criminal activity. And both sides know that like two armies opposing each other on a field, they have a disposition, a strength, a weakness, and they both feel that they can either win or lose. It's true that there are, in the middle of all this, there are people with genuine views. On one side or the other, they support or they don't support. They feel strongly about certain issues. But for the principles on either side of this conflict, they have a lot at stake. They've put their own money down, or other people's money is riding on it. As we've heard repeatedly over the last few days, there are weapons in play. And so in some senses, the answer to your question is that both sides feel that they've deployed the best army in the field, and that in order to win, there has to be a battle.
Not very good sign. Dr. Katia, you have worked in many countries. If you can rate difficulty on the scale of difficulty, what's the level of Thailand at the moment?
Difficulty, if one speaks in really based on macro variables, Thailand is not in a very difficult situation. It's a country that has a reasonably educated population. It's a country that is not facing a financial crisis. It's a country that has a social capital. It has an active civil society, very strong and sophisticated university campuses, young people who are engaged in politics and are interested in politics. All of those aspects are barriers against intense conflict. Any study with many cases of countries that have slid into conflict will tell you that are usually very poor countries with weak civil societies, dominating political parties and strong militaries. This is not the situation here. However, if we're talking about getting to dialogue, which is a different question as opposed to getting to war. So getting to war is harder, given the society we're talking about. But getting to dialogue is difficult. I have the impression, just as a newcomer, that as Michael said, there are a lot of interests on both sides, and that maybe what the next step is, after, apart from listening, which is the first crucial step, is to safeguard the interests of both sides, at least partially. And that's what is called a compromise. In other countries, people either agree to share economic power, to safeguard each other's access to special resources, to safeguard each other's access to the military, to the judiciary, whatever it is that the valuable resources are in a country that people are fighting about. The way to move forward is to decide that both sides can have access to them. And once that step is taken, in general, not in specifics, then a negotiation can start about the specifics. But I think Adam is very correct that if you don't listen about what it is that the other party is worried about, what interests they think are being threatened, why they feel so strongly about their position, then you cannot have that negotiation.
เอาละค่ะสถานการณ์อาจจะไม่ได้เลวร้ายจนเกินไปนะคะสำหรับประเทศไทยขึ้นอยู่กับการตัดสินใจของผู้นำของแต่ละฝ่ายนะคะว่าจะเดินเข้าสู่กระบวนการสารเสวนาการพูดคุยกันมากน้อยแค่ไหนพร้อมๆไปกับการพยายามสร้างพื้นที่กลางเพื่อที่จะเปิดให้การเดินหน้าปฏิรูปเดินหน้าต่อไปได้ค่ะเพื่อร่วมกันแก้ปัญหาความขัดแย้งในสังคมไทยและก็นี่ก็คือความคิดเห็นจากท่านวิทยากรทั้ง3ท่านนะคะที่มีประสบการณ์จากการทำงานเพื่อที่จะยุติความขัดแย้งสร้างความปรองดองในประเทศต่างๆค่ะวันนี้เป็นประสบการณ์ที่นำมาแลกเปลี่ยนร่วมกันค่ะ Thank you three of you for joining me ขอบคุณค่ะขอบคุณค่ะทั้งหมดคือที่นี่ไทย PBS สำหรับวันนี้ค่ะดิฉันณัฐฐา โกมลวาทินสวัสดีค่ะ